Good evening. Welcome to the third virtual Robert Lowell Memorial Lecture. We are so happy to have you all with us, and we are so disappointed, as we've said before, that we can't be here in person, but we are very grateful for this technology that allows us to come together virtually and still share poetry with one another. I'd like to say a special thanks to Annika Sari, who is behind the scenes running our tech tonight. So I don't want her to go unnoticed. My name is Annette Frost. I'm the director of the Favorite Poem Project here at BU, and we are so thrilled to be joined by two extraordinary poets this evening, Gail Mazur and Erin Caycedo-Kimura. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that there, immediately following the reading, there will be a Q&A with our readers. So as you listen, please feel free to drop questions for Gail or Erin into the Q&A section, and we will get to as many as we have time for after the reading. We will also be adding links for book sales into the chat box. Normally, when we're in person, we would have this wonderful reception and book signing. So in lieu of that, we hope to have an online frenzy of support of book buying. And without further ado, I will pass the mic over to the founder of the Favorite Poem Project and the director of BU's creative writing program, who will introduce the series. So please welcome Robert Pinsky.
Thanks so much, Annette. And I'm glad to do a little informal brief ado describing this series. And I'm going to do it this time somewhat historically. More than 20 years ago, when BU didn't have an adequate poetry reading series, I had a conversation with a wonderful person, a BU alumna, Nancy Livingston, and talking to Nancy about what we might do, the subject of room 222 came up, the room where Nicole Seeley, Carl Kirchway, and I still teach poetry classes, where Sigrid Nunez and Shui Fei Ha-Jin and Leslie Epstein teach the fiction workshops. And Nancy was a very no-nonsense person as well as a brilliant person. Her profession was advertising. She scorned euphemisms like public relations. And she had a good sense. She'd been very active in really creating the theater in San Francisco. And she absorbed, as few people do, the story that in that same room, Robert Lowell taught a writing class, a poetry class, in which the students were Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, George Starbuck, among others. And Nancy said, we will have this in the spirit of room 222, which is the spirit of art, grateful for an academic home, but not limited by the academic home. The series has included readings. Our past readers have included Seamus Heaney, Adam Zagajewski, Louise Glick, more recently, Terrence Hayes, Marilyn Chin, all reading with a BU MFA alum. A wonderful BU poetry MFA student, going back now about 8 or 9 years, was Luisa Caycedo-Kimura. And Luisa Caycedo-Kimura was a wonderful spirit as well as a wonderful poet. And her husband was an extremely impressive visual artist, fine artist, and cartoonist. And I believe at some point I did learn that he had originally trained as a quite serious musician at Juilliard. And he was a supportive, interesting mate, spouse of that poet. I was a little nervous when Aaron Caycedo-Kimura applied to the MFA program a couple of years ago. I knew this person, and it would be a little awkward if he didn't seem adequate. He's a wonderful writer. And this retrospective for me has to do with grief. Dear Nancy Livingston died a few years ago. And she dealt with such class and comic grace with having an extended illness. And this is an unusual Lowell reading in that it's a teacher and a student. Gail was the teacher of Aaron. They turned out to be an extremely good match in that way. And for me, the reading is part of my understanding of what a wonderful thing mourning is and what a beautiful thing grief can be. Aaron's chapbook, beautiful to look at, Ubasute, keeps his parents alive, again, with comedy, poignance, very graceful, well put together poems. Gail's new and selected poems, Land's End, is related in my mind to my dear friend, Michael Mazur, visual artist whose work is on the cover of Land's End. And in both of these books, grief is not the only subject, mourning is not the only subject by any means, and often doesn't strike a note we call elegiac. It's the note of art. And art is life. And since death is part of life, art deals with that in a way that cheers one up and is not boring. It's a pleasure for me to introduce a very unusual Robert Lowell reading. Our usual format that will follow is that Aaron will give a brief reading, and then he will introduce Gail, our headliner, and then we'll proceed to the Q&A in what Annette Frost, who's our wonderful director, would call a frenzy of interesting questions. Aaron Caycedo-Kimura.
Robert, thank you. Thank you for having me here tonight to read. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to read with Gail Mazur, someone I truly admire and respect. Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Annika, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight to this reading. I'm going to be reading 4 poems from my book, Ubasute. This chapbook was published by Slappering Hall Press of the Hudson Valley Writers Center this past March. I'm very grateful for them. This chapbook is about my parents. It touches on their experiences of World War II, of being newlyweds, of being parents, of settling in suburbia, and finally growing old and dying. The first poem I'd like to read is about when they first got married, before my sister and I came along. And this poem is called The Hardest Part. The fire truck siren downstairs raided the air of my mother's dreams. She'd scream in her sleep, my father told me. even after we married. More than a decade past the Second World War. For him, American concentration camps. For her, the firebombing of Tokyo. They moved into a San Francisco apartment that rented to Japs, a one-bedroom walk-up above the Post Street fire station. They painted their bathroom black. It was in style then. Shelved books, unboxed a new rice cooker, watered a shrub of Japanese maple potted for their future garden. When the station got a call in the middle of the night, the rumble of the overhead door crumbled into the wreck that was once her home. Swirling lights flashed ancient trees into flames through the thin silk curtains of her eyelids. No warning, no drill, no cover. My father stilled her body, his broad hand on her shoulder or hip as they lay in the dark, listening to the slowing of her breath. The hardest part of those nights, he said, was waiting, sometimes hours, for the truck and the men to come back. The title of my next poem is my mother's name. Her name was Hama. It's a Japanese name, spelled H-A-M-A. Hama. I ease a pen into the curl of mom's hand, ask her to sign a check. She sits on the edge of her bed, barely lucid, slowly forms H, A, a faint blue ballpoint cursive, a ripple, an echo. H, A, again, her hand can't write what comes next. Her name is Japanese for beach. I say, it's okay. Help her lie back. Wonder as her eyes close if her memory washes ashore somewhere. Goat Rock, Doran Park, bright and blustery, where with bare feet, pant legs rolled up, she watches I don't toddle too far into the surf. My next poem is a poem about my dad, and this poem is called Memorial. Straight as steel, hands on hips, Dad balances like a hood ornament on Irving Wasserman's head. Irv stands feet shoulder width apart, arms stretched out wide. A towel turban cushions his scalp. On the San Francisco Marina Green, sunbathers pay no attention to the two college gymnasts in tight swim trunks. The black and white image is attached to an email Irv sent this morning. He says he lost contact after my parents married 60 years ago, would like to reconnect. He doesn't know he's 7 years too late. No online obit, found me through my website. He calls my father remarkable, a word I never heard used to describe him. But yes, look, there he is, poised in the air, the husband who never cheated, the father who never struck me. And my last poem is entitled Afternoon Infusion, and this is about my mother. Afternoon Infusion. She panics 3 hellos as if startled by the noise of an empty house. Calls from St. Joseph's. The nurses are slow to start her hydration. I'm at a bar. Stevie Nicks reverbs in my beer, lures me back to the edge of 17 in this town I left 30 years ago. I take her call outside, stand away from the smokers. Half truth, I'm at the mall. She slurs a request. Milk of magnesia. And that other thing she can't remember. But I remember when I was a boy. She told me about the mythical Japanese custom, ubasute. A grown son lifts his aged mother on his back, delivers her to a mountain, leaves her to die. I'll come pick you up after chemo, I say, and hang up, realizing she's already cradled by the mountain. The waft of cigarette smoke and hint of manure in Santa Rosa air usher me back into the restaurant. The hostess smiles, welcomes me. Clueless, I have come and gone. Thank you. And now it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Gail Mazur, and I sincerely mean that. Gail Mazur's work has been widely anthologized, including in several Pushcart Prize anthologies and the Best American Poetry. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Bunting Institute of Radcliffe College, and the Radcliffe Institute. Gail is the author of 8 books of poetry, including They Can't Take That Away From Me, which was a finalist for the 2001 National Book Award, and Zeppo's First Wife, New and Selected Poems, winner of the 2006 Massachusetts Book Prize. Her most recent book is Land's End. This collection contains stunning new poems as well as a retrospective of work from her previous 7 books. I highly recommend Land's End as essential to anyone's book collection. I know that it's one that I'll be returning to again and again. Gail's work is intelligent, transparent, rich, and elegant, with a dose of that subtle humor of hers. When you read a Gail Mazur poem, you know you're reading something very special. On the page, she creates detailed, vivid experiences which pull you right in so you can experience them for yourself. And you do. Gail is exceptional at her craft. What carries over from poet to her poetry is something genuine and heartfelt. But what I really want to say about Gail Mazur is that she is not only an exceptional poet, but she is an exceptional person. I had the privilege of studying with her for 1 semester while I was at BU in 2020, and there's no way I can adequately convey to you the admiration and respect that I have for her. I'm beyond grateful for her generosity and encouragement. I remember while we were going through my thesis together, she stopped suddenly and asked me with a very concerned tone of voice, am I saying too much? That's Gail, humble and trying to be very careful not to kill the student's spirit and trying to ensure that the work is his own. But the feedback and criticism she was giving me was, in fact, a great encouragement. Also, not too long ago, I believe it was at a Blacksmith House poetry reading during the Q&A portion of the evening, Gail Lloyd Schwartz and Andrea Cohen were talking about when Gail first started the series in the early 70s. And it was mentioned that some of the people Gail invited to read didn't even have books yet. And again, that's Gail, interested in giving all poets, even ones just starting out, the opportunity to have their voices heard and supported. She believes there's room for everyone. All this to say, in addition to being an exceptional poet and person, Gail is an exceptional literary citizen. And this is the kind of poet that Gail Mazur inspires me to try to be. Please help me welcome Gail Mazur.
Thank you, Aaron. What a wonderful reading, and what a joy it was to have you as a student and to have you as a colleague now. Can I be heard? Okay. I'm going to read mostly from this book, since it's a collected. And I'm not going to read in any particular chronological order, but just according to my whims, my rehearsed whims. The first poem I'm going to read is called Hall Mirror. Hall Mirror. Federal style, 2 small chips in the gilt frame, found at a flea market in the Eisenhower 50s. 19th century American, lovingly refinished, loving gift of my mother. There's a Freudian slip. Loving guilt of my mother, loving gift of my mother. It's too good for you, so take care of it. Some winter mornings here, the taut, lit face of Ethel Rosenberg, or the ecstatic face of Blake. Punim of my 6-year-old grandmother, arriving stunned and mute from Vilna, her big sister Lena waiting, who knew what was at stake. Oh, my fierce mother, standing away at the kitchen table, protected by newspapers, the Herald, the Forward, the Traveler, her little brush, her jar of paste, preserving and inventing the past. For what? For me. For today, half-conscious glimpse of myself on my way out for a walk in February snow with a friend or alone. My blue woolen hat, my mirror smile. I taught in several different states, in several different states of America and several different states of mind. And I'm going to read, and I was never much of a traveler, so a lot of my traveling has come from being a poet. This poem is called In Houston, and it's sort of about the sort of displacement and the magic of displacement and the undertow of the magic. In Houston, I dislocated my life, so I went to the zoo. It was December, but it wasn't December. Pansies just planted were bloomed in well-groomed beds. Lovers embraced under the sky's Sunday blue. Children rode around and around on pastel trains. I read the labels stuck on every cage, the way people at museums do, art being less interesting than information. Each fenced-in plot had a map laminated with a stain to tell where in the world the animals had been taken from. Rhinos waited for rain in the rhino-colored dirt, too grief-struck to move their wrinkles, their horns too weak to ever be hacked off by poachers for aphrodisiacs. 5 white ducks agitated the chalky waters of a duck pond with invisible orange feet, while a little girl in pink ruffles tossed pork rinds at their disconsolate backs. This wasn't my life. I'd meant to look with the wise, tough eye of exile. I wanted not to anthropomorphize, not to equate, for instance, the lemur's displacement with my displacement. The arched aviary flashed with extravagance, plumage so exuberant, so implausible, it seemed cartoonish, and the bird songs unintelligible, babble, all their various languages unraveling. No bird can get its song sung right, separated from models of its own species. For weeks, I hadn't written a sentence. For 2 days, I hadn't spoken to an animate thing. I couldn't relate to a giraffe. I couldn't look one in the face. I'd have said, if anyone had asked, I'd been mugged by the Gulf climate. In a great barren space, I watched a pair of elephants swaying together, a rhythm too familiar to be mistaken, too exclusive. My eyes sweated to see the bull, his masterful trunk swinging, enter their barn of concrete blocks, to watch his obedient wife follow. I missed the bitter, tinny Boston smell of first snow, the huddling in the cold bus tunnel. At the House of Nocturnal Mammals, I stepped into a furtive world of bats, averted my eyes at the gloomy dioramas, past glassed-in booths of lurking rodents. Had I known I'd find what I came for at last? How did we get here, dear sloth, my soul, my sister? Clinging to a tree limb with your 3-toed feet, your eyes closed tight, you calmed my idleness, my immigrant isolation. But a tiny tamarin monkey who shares your ersatz rainforest runs at you, teasing, until you move one dripping, hairy arm, then the other, the other, the other, pulling your tear-soaked body, its too few vertebrae, its inferior allotment of muscles along the dead branch, going almost nowhere, slowly as is humanly possible, nudged by the bright orange primate, taunting, nipping, itching at you all the time, like ambition. Whatever they want. This was also written in Houston, or after Houston. To be honest, I wrote one poem in Houston in a year. Whatever they want. Tonight, my students can ask me anything. I'll tell them the story of my life, whatever they want. Outside, traffic shimmers in the Gulf haze. Mosquitoes incubate in the bayou. My students laugh softly at the broad A of my accent, evidence, if they need it, of my vulnerability, a woman fallible enough to be their mother. And it's easy, I'm easy, with their drawled interrogations, their curiosity, the way they listen without memory or desire every Monday, while I peel another layer from the onion, the tearjerker, while the air conditioner in the classroom stirs the fine hairs on their arms, and I forget the cool protections of irony, giving them my suffering family, my appendectomy, my transcendent first kisses. What kind of teaching is this? I transport them with me to Maine, to the Ukraine. They see my great uncle's dementia, My cat's diabetes, exotica of gloom, pratfalls, romantic fantasias, extravagant sleet, snow, sweet innuendos. They ask for it. They want to tell me things too. Texas stories with boats, with dead fathers, with shrimp boats, with boots, with dead fathers, with shrimp boats, with malls, with grackles, with fire ants, with ice houses, with neon, with rifles, and the holy scriptures, inexhaustible reality. When I drive home singing past the palm trees and the tenebrous live oaks and the taquerias, I'm in the movies. And later when I sleep, I dream of my babies, their insatiable hungers. I give them permission to say whatever they want, as long as there's no meanness in it, as long as words taste bittersweet, as long as they're true, as long as they move me. The next poem I'm going to read is called Mount Fuji, which is the most famous Japan mountain that was, I guess you can't say immortalized by Hokusai, but maybe it immortalized Hokusai. It's an image that he made over and over again. And this is addressed to my husband, Michael. Mount Fuji, Hokusai and Hiroshige, my first presents to you, 2 linen-bound books that closed with looped ribbons and faux ivory clasps. Days later, we gaped at Fuji from a window of Japan Air and gasped together in Narita, a park so immaculate, white rocks gleamed graphic in a river of gravel. Later still, you'd move between the floating worlds of ukiyo-e woodcuts and Japanese and Chinese landscapes, whose surfaces entered you as if it had been faded. A draftsman, Hokusai at 70, thought he'd begun to grasp the structures of birds and beasts, insects and fish, of the way plants grow. Hoped by 90, he'd have penetrated to their essential nature, that's Hokusai, and moved by more by 100, I will have reached the stage where every dot, every mark I make will be alive. You always loved that resolve, you repeat joyfully, Hokusai's utterance of faith in work's possibilities, its reward, that at 130, he'd perhaps have learned to draw. In Edo then, his beloved Fuji was seen as the true source of immortality, as for him it was to be. Will you always give me such spectacular gifts? You asked me that day when we were 20. Forbidden City. Asleep until noon, I'm dreaming we've been granted another year. You're here with me, healthy, then half awake, the half truth. This is our last day. Life's leaking away again, and this time we know it. Dear body, I hold you pleading, don't leave. But I understand you can't say anything. Who are we? Are we fictional? We don't look like our pictures, don't look like anyone I know. Daylight flickers through a bamboo grove. We approach the Forbidden City, looking together for the hall of fulfilling original wishes. Time is the treasure, you tell me, and the past is its hiding place. I instruct our fictional children, the past is the treasure, time is its hiding place. If we told him how much we love him, how much we miss him. He could stay. But now you've taken me back to Loyang, to the garden of solitary joy over 1,000 years old. I wake. I hold your hand. You let me go. The next poem is actually a translation by Michelangelo, a poem that he wrote to his friend Giovanni da Pistoia when he was painting the vault of the Sistine Chapel, and spectacularly convinced that it was an utter failure and that he was a failure as an artist. To Giovanni da Pistoia, when the author was painting the vault of the Sistine Chapel, 1509. I had read several 19th century translations of this, but I hadn't read a great translation, so it was irresistible to try to do it. On my first trip with Michael to Florence, I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy or anywhere else where the stagnant water's poison. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket, my breast twists like a harpy's. My brush above me all the time dribbles paint so my face makes a fine floor for droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe. Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend it from me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. I thought that that poem could reassure a lot of painters when they're discouraged. But I didn't do it for them, I did it for me. To the makers, and this isn't after the great poem Lament for the Makers, but the title is after that. To the makers, you were like famous cities with rivers and traffic, with architecture from ingenious eras, with protest marches and festivals, museums and pharmacies and criminal pleasures, all the essentials needed to endure. Reading you, I revisit your structures of grids and avenues, your alleys. I follow overgrown paths. I revisit the terror and joy of being lost, the ways to court discomfort, to dare chaos, the knowledge of drowning in a pitch dark harbor. Tyranny and wars advanced in your histories. Also, infirmities of soul and body were your portion. Yet you were not yearning only, not heartbreak only. You were not the loneliest people alive. There was your work, and then you had one another. You spoke with gods and heroes. You cherished your conversations in many languages. It is true, you were secretive, observers, spies, But that was it as it has to be. It was only your work you were given to serve. You weren't mere investigators of useless things. The pragmatic seemed no more or less suggestive to you than articles of turbulence or rapture, strands of hair in a basin, light in a dusty stairwell, a pitcher of sangria, woe and laughter, the feel in the hand of a broken thing. Day by day, your lives were a tumult of beginnings. When you began, you couldn't know. This you keep showing me, where your constructions would lead. What you made from the inchoate, muscled and shaped, not toward the monumental, but toward a form of truth that would matter. The inaccessible become necessary. Though I am speaking to you, I'm not alone, nurtured by your art. Even today, you animate the minutiae of the vast unsigned cosmos. And though the 20th century ended without you, now decades after your precipitate departures, your pages are still touched by many, still touch many, and the lit screens you never used sing your lines. Figures in a landscape. We were two figures in the landscape in the middle distance in summer. In the foreground, twisty olive trees. A mild wind made the little dry leaves tremble. Then, of course, the horizon, the radiant blue sky. The maker was hungry for light. Light silvered the leaves, a stream. I like to think for your sake, the scene was Italian, 17th century. Viewed from here, we resembled one another, though in truth we were unalike. And we were tiny. He'd kept us small so the painting would be landscape, not anecdote. We were made things, deftly assembled, but beginning to show wear. You, muscular, sculptural, and I was I. We were different. We had a story. On good days, we found comedy in that, pratfalls, and also great sadness. Sun moved across the sky and lowered until you, then I were in shadow, bereft. The Renaissance had ended. We'd long known we were mortal. In shadow, I held the wild daisies and cosmos we'd been gathering for the table. Then the sky behind us pinked and inflamed the landscape where we were left to our own reinvention. Two silhouettes who still had places they meant to travel, who were not abstractions. Had you pricked them, they'd have bled, alizarin crimson. I wanted to walk by myself a while, but I'd always been afraid to lose you. And the naked olive groves were hovering as if to surround you. That was the problem. I craved loneliness. I needed the warmth of love. If no one looks at us, do we or don't we disappear? The landscape would survive without us. We are in it. It's not landscape any more than the horizon's a line you could stand on. I'm going to read just 2 or 3 more poems. One, this is a sort of, this is This is a poem that I wrote to the poet Tony Hoagland, who died a couple of years ago. I have some funny feelings about it because it starts with his inscription of an inscription on his book to me, which seems kind of flattering to me. But that's how I got into the poem, and it hasn't come out. Inscription. Bless you, he wrote on his title page, and your funny, heartbreaking poems. And I thank my friend who died last year too soon, my funny, unincorporated friend. I think he'd like it, really like it, if I made a joke now, with the July sun ready to laugh with us, and the tide determined to wash grief away, though I'm not ready to laugh, not yet. But thanks, dear Tony, for blessing me and reminding me how Lowell answered when a friend asked him how he'd want to be remembered. They were crossing the campus he'd fled decades before, where his ancestors loomed, judgmental, iconic, and where now he taught. Two colleagues, well employed. Heartbreaking was his reply. One word for all that history, intelligence, pain, and wit. And the last poem I'm going to read is the sort of title poem. It's called At Land's End, not Land's End. So I don't know if I'm allowed to call that a title poem. But I guess I can say I'm allowed to do whatever I want, right? It's my turn at the mic. At Land's End. And the Stanley that I refer to is Stanley Kunitz, who was a famously great gardener in Provincetown and who lived to be 101 at Land's End. This garden, its descendant of Stanley's anemones, flowing, pearlescent, like the nacre of shells, their offspring mine now in my yard, fragile beside the orange glare of Dugan's trumpet vine, my almanac of inheritances swanning around my own bee balm and butterfly bush, monarchs and black swallowtails fluttering, a sunflower bowing its great human head toward the sun, the garden's heart, the lilies, its consoling perfumes, the richesse of memory. What would they say today, I wonder, our old ones? Stanley, ancient and clear-eyed, ready to jump into action, and Dugan, irascible, of furious activism far in his past, removed really, past caring about much, yet somehow bracing, abrasive. There, our century long over, and today's news preposterous, still somehow unthinkable. A savage clown at the helm, breaking the toys of the circus he never liked anyway. Every treasure, every human pact, tossed aside as if they were created to be broken. Playthings of the world, mortal, uprooted. Oh, Stanley, tending your cultivated dune under the sun of justice, wiry, undefeated, feeding your annual seedlings. One late afternoon long ago, a little too early for martinis, you lay down your clippers on warm flagstone by a withering clump of weeds. Gail, you said, grabbing my wrist, urgent. What are we going to do about Bosnia? Where did it come from? Where does it go, that sense of agency? You so ready to drop your tools, compost the cuttings, compost your newspapers for the garden's future, the Times, the Globe, as if here at Land's End, here on the coast, urgent, together we'd have energies to do battle forever. as if we could rescue the guttering world. Thank you.
Gail, thank you. Erin, thank you. Gosh, I'm overwhelmed. What an absolutely beautiful evening. Thank you both so much. I'm gonna send in this chat again links for buying books as we move into the Q&A. So please go to those links and check out those books so you can have these in person. Wow, that was just a beautiful reading. Thank you both. Please go ahead and send us questions directly into the Q&A. Let us know if you're having any trouble accessing it, and we can send it into the chat, but otherwise pop your questions directly into the Q&A. And I'm going to start with an anonymous question that has come in. Each of you write poems that place great importance on the small objects and actions that one might in the moment dismiss as minutiae. How do you train yourselves to be so observant as to catch such things? And Gail, you're muted again, so go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, if you fail to see the big picture all the time, it's easy to get the little things. No, I mean, I think who said God is in the details, and someone else said the devil is in the details. I think they're both true, but the details so often carry the narrative. They're not abstract. Aaron?
How do you train yourself? I think that's just the work of the poet. You know, you have to sit down or while you're walking and just pay attention. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and you want to be able to create that experience for the reader. So that's very important. Those little sensory details.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Or the flagstones, for an example of the detail. Were the flagstones really warm when he put his clippers down on them?
Sure.
Or it just seemed to you like a really cool thing to say before you talk about the guttering newspapers? Did you make that up?
It was summer. Flagstones are hot.
Yeah.
It isn't whether you made them up.
She made it up. She made it up.
Oh, no.
That's great.
No.
Another anonymous question. How do you create portraits of grief? We've saw, both of your poems are heavily connected with grief in these two collections. How do you create portraits of grief without falling into the trap of over sentimentalizing?
Aaron, you go first. Your turn.
How do you do that? I think when you're writing about very emotional subjects, it's important to take a step back. And as I mentioned before, you want to be able to create an experience for a person to step into for themselves, to experience those emotions for themselves. And that makes it all the more powerful. So how do you create that portrait of grief? I think it's important to step back and, as Gail said, create the details, write down the details of the moment, the scene. So the person could, experience them for themselves.
Great, thank you.
Right, it's never, you certainly don't want to lead with a description of your feelings. I mean, it's possible that the poem might earn you the right to mention them, but the details really, and in the process, you enlarge your own emotional capacity, I think. You know, if you make yourself think like a writer when you're doing it, when you're writing the poem, if you make yourself notice, you're sort of giving yourself back some of the richness that grief can be leaching away from you.
I think it's also important how you describe the details and which ones to include that will create that moment to indicate to the reader what you're feeling.
Yeah, that's where the writer comes in.
Speaking of, we have another question about grief, which is actually from one of my students, Han. Why do you think grief, an immensely painful emotion, can create such beautiful art?
Well, partly because if you're grieving for something that you love. And I'm not saying that sentimentally. So you have a whole repertoire of ways that you've been thinking about and loving these people or this place or this culture. You know,
we have several questions that are coming in about visual art, media, and your inspiration as poets, and your relationship with visual art. So one of them is, what is a main piece of media that has inspired you as a poet? Another question is, what are the main similarities for you among music, visual art, and poetry? And just anything you want to say about your relationship to visual art and poetry for inspiration.
are you being polite, Aaron, and letting me go first?
I yeah.
Thanks. Well, I would just say I'll just say something about visual arts. Having lived with a painter from the time I was 20, it is one of the languages that I have to that I can use without using the language of grief, but it can convey. You know, I mean, all the arts convey. And if I were, I wouldn't even say if I were to write how I felt, it would just be garbage poured out on the page, because this is how I need to think about what I love and what I've lost, you know, and how to keep the loss from being total. And I don't mean I have a little laryngitis. I don't mean to fall into a pathetic noise that I'm making here. It's, for me, it's given me the language. I can't do, even that's too self-conscious. It's the way I honor the love that I have. That's more precious, but I mean it.
Thank you.
Robert's question about what are the main similarities among music, visual art, and poetry. You know, it's something I think about all the time, and I never can seem to put it into words or express it. I often compare visual art to poetry, and I always think that Frank O'Hara, in his poem "Why I'm Not an Artist," says it the best. And I've tried to write poems about the similarity between painting and poetry, but it never compares to that poem. Like Gail said, there's a line that runs through all the arts, whether you're a dancer, a singer, instrumentalist, poet, it's a very similar process, I guess, way of thinking, and product too. I mean, I consider my paintings as, just pieces of visual poetry. I'm trying to say something, and then I'm editing it down to get this thing. So I guess there you go. There's a similarity. That's what we do with poetry,
Right. And it's all in some way at heart, it begins with expressiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And then the making is what we can do with what we're given.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's why, that my poem to the makers isn't exactly an homage to Lament for the Makers, but it's an homage to the title, Lament, of the Lament.
Thank you. Those are great answers. We have another one here that says, in your poems, how are you able to balance large and abstract feelings, themes, concepts with the tiny and small and fleeting? How do you present the details in ways that communicate the bigger picture?
That's the secret.
And
this sounds really prosaic, but say case by case. But you have your bullshit antennae out, and you have, you want to be sure you're being honest. You want to be sure you're making the sounds that you want to make. There's so much that goes into it, and the better crafted it is, the more it's likely to, in the end, satisfy you. And in ways that you might not have predicted when you began. Usually you can't predict it when you begin. It begins with one stroke of the pen or brush. Those are hard questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. I try not to think about the big stuff, when I'm making a poem or making a painting. I concentrate on what it is that I can shape and do, and then as you revise and work it through, it all comes somehow. Who knows where a poem comes from?
Right, and who knows when in the revising it comes from, and how near it is to what you intended, or if you even knew what you intended.
Right.
So true.
Then you take credit for your intentions that you didn't really know about.
This next question is from Sean Beckett, who I think, Gail, you had as a student, possibly. He was an MFA of this program. Professor Mazur, I so enjoyed hearing your Michelangelo translation again. It is such an encouragement to not give up on the creative process. A question for both you and Aaron. How do you find encouragement when you are frustrated in art? Erin, as a painter, are there different ways you overcome creative roadblocks in painting versus poetry? We've heard this question earlier in our discussion, but here it is again. How do you get past that frustration of a creative roadblock?
You know, one great thing about having painting and poetry is that if I'm frustrated with one of them, I could go to the other, you know, and I could say, I'm not a poet anymore, I'm a painter. And if my painting's horrible, I could say, you know, I'm more of a poet today.
Gee, if my poem's awful, I can only go to the refrigerator. But
I do that too.
I think sometimes you know what your intention is when you begin, and sometimes your intention grows with the process. I mean, it can be magic. It can be magic, but the magic has to come out of your efforts somehow. I think when you're a kid, you might think it's just magic, you know, and if you're not touched with the magic touch, you can't do it.
I think when you find yourself frustrated, you have to learn that that's just a part of the writing life. You know, it's not the first time it happened. It's certainly not going to be the last. And it's just part of it all. It doesn't.
Yeah, and you have to love the work. I mean, there's one thing I must say, that getting married really as a child, to live with somebody who did not always love the thing he was working on, who had great frustration. He loved the work. He loved working. He loved breaking through and solving it, or, you know, it just, it was a real model of sort of tenacity and just sort of deep sort of gratification in the process itself.
Thank you. Yeah, well said. We have one.
That's an ideal.
We have a question again from a student, from Melissa. What advice could you give to someone trying to find their style?
Imitate, imitate, imitate. Try to write poems like the poems that you admire. In the end, it's going to have to end up being your style, because imitation will only carry you so far, but you get you get trained, you get your mind, your brain and your hand trained. You know, you get the sense of the line. It gets to be part of the way your brain works.
I also think it's very important to read a lot.
You have to do that to imitate.
Yes. Read a lot, imitate, and you know, pay attention to what speaks to you. And as Gail said, in the end, you know, you who you are is gonna come through whether you like it or not.
It's true that imitating, it's like, I forget, it gives you muscle memory. The muscle is the brain in that case. You know, it's like copying.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's such a challenge, and creates such surprising things too. Imitation, direct imitation too. We have another question from Robert, which is Robert's laughing over there in the background. He has all the power right now. Do you have positive and/or negative thoughts about writing workshops?
Yes.
It was for no question, so perfect.
Good question, yes.
Would you care to elaborate?
So that was yes, next question.
No, I do, but for instance, it matters who's leading the workshop. You know, I mean, it's sort of, you know, there are thousands of writing workshops now, probably in Massachusetts, but you know, if people are looking to do that, they should really try to find the right teacher for themselves, which isn't always easy. But I think the feedback is something that you know, that ultimately we want from our poet friends, you know, but where are you going to make those friends? Often it's in a workshop.
Speaking of workshops, and Erin, you can elaborate on that question more if you want to with this. We have another anonymous question asking if you two could speak a little bit more about working together as teacher and student in your own workshop when you were at the BU MFA program.
Which feels like such a long time ago. It was only, what, a year ago, year and a half ago?
Yeah, I get mixed up because of the pandemic. For a long time, I thought it was last year, but last year didn't exist.
No, it didn't.
Well, as a teacher, I would say have students who are like Aaron. That's the clue.
Going back to the other question about the you know, positive, negative about workshops. Yeah, it all depends on, you know, the individual's goals, what they want to get out of it. For me personally, you know, workshops are great, but I think as I go along working on my own work, it's more helpful to have a certain number of trusted friends around you. And I've been very fortunate to have that, including some of my cohort members. We still meet every once in a while, which is great. But having good readers of your work is very important.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I mean, I think for me, moving to Cambridge and suddenly knowing poets was kind of a leap ahead in my life. I mean, I used to think if I would approach my brilliant and very literate husband with a piece of paper in my hand, he would look stricken, like, oh, he was going to fail me again, you know. And you did. He didn't know I didn't want tough criticism.
Another question about content from a student. After writing about something as painful as grief in poetry, do you find it difficult to then go back and write about something lighter and more joyful? And how do you make that transition? What is joyful poetry? But how do you make that transition?
I don't know if I write joyful. Grief is interesting. Like, grief and hard things and sadness. Right now, I'm trying to write about my musical past, which left a lot of scars with me. So, you know, I've snuck in a couple joyful poems now and then, but it's not hard. It's always good to get a palate cleanser in there.
I'll interrupt. when I think of the chapbook, I think of images like your father in Golden Gate Park standing on the other guy's head, and the young couple, because they are, quote, quoting the poem, Japs, end quote, the only apartment they can find is above a firehouse. And the worst part is waiting for the truck to come back.
Right.
This is grief, and it's funny.
Right. 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 And so it's also actually, Robert, it has to do with the temperament of the writer.
I always think that humor sort of makes the grief griefier, it's, it's just, yeah.
Well said. What was it Gail said earlier? You want to break the reader's heart, but not all the way.
Right.
That
Just
was
like half twist.
want to strain it. Yeah, just almost all the way. We have at least one more question. When, from a student again, when was the first time you thought to yourself that you've made a true piece of art? And when was the first time you felt a personal sense of triumph for your poetry?
Okay, I could go first.
Yes.
The first part, I don't know how to answer that. When I made I'm assuming that this has to do with poetry, not my painting, but I think maybe when I got my first poem published, I was pretty shocked, and that was a pretty big triumph. And that poem is actually in my chapbook. It looks a lot different. Well, not a lot different, but it does look different from when I did get it published. But that was, yeah, that was a big step for me.
Yeah, I think the first publication, no matter where it is it's some kind of confirmation, no matter how modest. I don't really remember. I mean, my worldly ambitions were pretty modest to begin with. I will say that an early highlight was when I wrote a poem called Baseball.
Mhm.
And it was published in Plowshares. And an acquaintance of mine named Robert Pinsky told me he thought it was great. And I thought, wow, it must be pretty good. I got to go read it. Hey, this isn't so bad. But, so just sometimes more than the people that know you best and love you best, sometimes some affirmation really does make a difference in the beginning. I mean, it always makes a difference. But I just kind of felt like a star is born.
That's sort of a perfect segue. I was going to ask whether or not your own opinion or thoughts about a piece that you've written can change drastically based on feedback that you receive from somebody else, or do you tend to feel centered in your own opinion of the poem and have it less influenced by that feedback?
I think we're affected by feedback. I'm affected by feedback. And good feedback has a good effect. And bad feedback could make an enemy. And And that's not true, but I mean, but I think early on, positive feedback, because if you, as I wasn't, if you never took a workshop, then having a positive feedback to a poem is very validating. I mean, it shouldn't have to be, but it is.
And it also depends on who's giving the feedback. I don't need feedback in order to feel differently about my poems. Sometimes I go to bed hating them and I wake up in the morning and it's like, yeah, it's not that bad. And then I end up hating it again by lunchtime.
Right.
We are not always the best readers of our own work. So it's important to get feedback from trusted people.
Right. And it's easy to be shaken. It's easy to be shaken in your confidence in something you just wrote.
So it's all part of the artist's life. Yeah.
Right. It's not a hard life.
Erin, one more question about painting and poetry. Do you find that the two can sort of trade off with one another? Are you ever writing a poem and suddenly a painting pops into your mind, or are you ever, painting a painting and suddenly a poem sneaks into your mind? Do you go back and forth like that, or does one painting beget painting, etc.?
I can't think of an instance where that has happened. I can't think of an instance where that has happened, where I think of a poem when I'm painting. What happens is I think about my painting or my poetry while I'm walking, and then I'll get the inspiration, but not while I'm doing the activity. And I'm doing this because my easel's over there. So but it is nice to go back and forth. It is a creative endeavor that you keep engaged in some sort of creative way. But I get the question a lot whether I write poems about my paintings, and I rarely do. I don't do that so far.
Well, one last question for you both before we wrap up the evening. I know in the BU Today article that both of you mentioned revision being an essential part of your process. And I was just thinking about Richard Hugo's notion of the triggering town, and having there be something that triggers the secondary, one subject, and finding your primary subject later on in a poem. And I was wondering, when you start writing a poem, whether it's from a bit of music or some words that have come together, do you find that you know your primary subject right away, or that it comes to you later on in the process of writing the piece?
Every case is different.
That's just what I was going to say.
Yeah. It's like, you may know, you may not know. It's nice when you don't know. You start a piece and see where it takes you.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you both so much again. I'm just making sure there are no more questions I missed in the chat, because some of them came through here. But no, I think that's everything. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Robert again, just to say adieu for the evening. We hope to have you back for this spring installment. We'll have details forthcoming on that. Thank you again to Annika for behind the scenes work, and thank you so much to all of our participants for being here. And of course, well, Robert will speak more to the rest, but thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.
A lot of credit to Annette Frost for making this a good evening, and for Annika, a particularly memorable one for me. I may have neglected in my introduction to mention that Nancy Livingston and her husband, Fred Levin, through the Shenson Foundation, have made this reading series possible, something like 25 years worth of it now. And this is one of the truly memorable ones. It had its own nature. I can't think of another time it was a student and a teacher, probably was one. And I think a terrible curse is going to fall on anyone who watches this reading and doesn't buy those books.
Yes.
Applause for all.